John Marsh here, and in this video I'm going to go over some digital mixer basics focusing on the Soundcraft UI24. First of all, we'll look at an analog mixer, and here is the Soundcraft Signature 12, and it's the multi-track version of the Signature 12, meaning that it's got USB in and out. Okay, and that gives it a lot of capabilities. But the basic idea of an analog mixer is that we've got hardware inputs, and that is these hardware inputs either for microphone inputs or for line inputs, and we've got a number of those here. We've got, along with the hardware inputs, for each of the hardware inputs we've got a gain knob, and I'll draw here the schematic of the mixer. Each hardware input has a gain knob, and there are a number of channels, and these are laid out vertically like this. So each hardware input has a gain, and then we've got auxiliary channels. I'll just draw 3 of them here. Okay, so we have hardware inputs, and we have a gain for each hardware input, and then we can send any given channel, channels 1, 2, and 3, for example, off to these auxiliary buses, as they're called. And finally, we have the master fader, and we have a balance control for each of these, or a pan control, actually, for each of these channels. So the master fader and the pan control adjusts the send of that channel to what's called the master output, and I'll draw that over here, and it's got its own fader. Okay, and we also have masters for each of the auxiliary channels. So each of these auxiliary buses, as they're called, 1, 2, and 3 here, has a send from each of the channels. So here's the send from channel 1 to auxiliary 1, channel 1 to auxiliary 2, etc. And then these are the auxiliary masters. Okay, so we've got a number of different hardware outputs on the device also. And these are shown here. We have our master left and right, the stereo master. We also have auxiliaries 1, 2, and 3, as shown here. We've got also group 1, group 2, and headphones, but I'm not going to go over all of that here. Just the basics here. Okay, so we also have hardware outs, and these hardware outs include the master left, right, and also the auxiliaries. Okay, so these are the hardware outs, and here's the master left, right. Master left, right. These are hardware outs. And here's our auxiliary 1, 2, and 3 outs. Okay, so the basic functionality of the mixer is that we have multiple inputs, hardware inputs. They are sent to the mixer, which takes multiple channels of input and sends them to auxiliary channels and sends them to the master channel. Okay, and the master channel has a hardware output, and the auxiliary channels have a hardware output. Okay, the master channel is typically used for your PA system. Auxiliary channel is typically used for things like monitor mixes. And that's the basic idea of the mixer. And what I'll show you here next is that the digital mixer has that basic functionality plus a lot more. So here is the digital mixer. This is the Soundcraft UI24, and you will see here that it has a whole bunch of hardware inputs, 20 of them. It has master outs, and it also has auxiliary outs, and so it has more of everything. It also has a USB connection here to the computer, the same way the analog mixer did. And I'll talk more about that. So here's a picture of that UI24 again, showing the hardware inputs 1 through 20, the auxiliary outputs 1 through 8, the master left-right outputs. And it turns out, I've also labeled here, that through the USB connector to the digital audio workstation, I use Logic Pro, slots 1 through 10 on the USB output come from, well, 1 and 2 come from the master, left, right. 3 through 10 come through auxiliary channels 1 through 8, hardware outputs. And then starting with 11, we have channels 1 through 20 is 11 through 30, okay, on the USB slots 11 through 30. So these are the hardwired USB outputs, okay, on this. So what we're going to do for understanding the digital mixers is think in terms of sources and destinations. We have signal sources that include hardware inputs. They include USB slots 1 through 32 on the input. The slots I'm talking about up here are output from the Soundcraft to, say, Logic Pro or your digital audio workstation. Here we're talking about inputs from the computer to the mixer. And we also have then sources, which are the master outputs of the DSP. And so I've called this the digital signal processing matrix. And that is what we're thinking of as this mixer here. This whole main part of the mixer here is what I'll be calling in the digital mixer the DSP matrix. It has inputs, allows you to adjust all the levels, and it has outputs, okay? So our sources include the outputs of the DSP, the inputs from the computer into the mixer, say outputs from Logic Pro, and then hardware inputs. Destinations now include the DSP mixer channel inputs 1 through 20. So this is the mixer, again, the DSP. And then outputs also include the hardware outputs. These are also destinations, okay? There is another set of destinations, which is the USB out. But these are hardwired, so I'm not including them in this picture. And the hardwiring of the USB outs is shown up here, okay? Okay, so here is a picture of the UI24 with hardware inputs coming in as sources. Those hardware inputs are by default, these are the default matrix mappings here, mapped 1-to-1 to the DSP mixer channel inputs. So hardware input number 10 will go to channel 10 on the DSP master, okay? Into the matrix, into the mixing matrix, and then back out of the mixing matrix is your DSP master outs. Coming out of the mixer matrix, we go and we have our default mappings to the hardware outputs as destinations. So in these diagrams, we're always going in at the top, out at the right, okay? So we have sources at the top, destinations at the right. Okay, so the default is that we have hardware inputs. We send them into the DSP matrix. The DSP matrix comes out, and they are mapped by default to the hardware outs. Okay, and that's the way the normal analog mixer works. Okay, and I'm showing here that you can go ahead and consider the USB output slots as destinations, in which case it's the outputs of the mixing matrix that are sent to slots 1 through 10. That is master left right, auxiliaries 1 through 8 on 3 through 10, and then hardware inputs can be also sent out USB slots 11 through 30. Okay, and when you go to the UI24, you will see this in what's called the patching matrix. And I'll show you this now. This is the patch matrix, and this shows hardware inputs at the top as sources, and it shows the channels, what they call channels here. This is what I'm calling the DSP mixer channel inputs. And these down the diagonal are the default mappings. So this diagram here, what you see with channels as destinations and hardware inputs as sources, is these defaults here. What we're seeing down below here is the other set of defaults in the middle of the diagram at left, and this is with sources which are called masters. This set of sources called masters is the DSP outputs, master left right, auxiliaries 1 through 8. There are actually 10 auxiliaries in the matrix, and hardware 1, headphone 1 left and right, headphone 2 left and right. So masters is really the DSP mixer output, and they are mapped by default 1-to-1 to the hardware outputs. And these are the hardware outputs: master left, right, auxiliary 1 through 8, headphone 1, and headphone 2. Notice that auxiliaries 9 and 10 exist inside the matrix, but they don't map to an output because there's only 8 auxiliary outs in hardware. Okay, so this is the idea. And so right now with these defaults, mapping hardware inputs to the input of the DSP mixer, mapping the outputs of the DSP mixer to the hardware outputs, this is just like the analog mixer. But you'll see we've got lots of other opportunities here for what is called patching. And that's what makes a digital mixer so much more flexible. Here's, again, the same basic picture labeled with lots of little channel numbers. So this shows sources which include hardware inputs, DSP master outputs, USB digital audio workstation slots 1 through 16, 17 through 32. So here's all your possible sources along the top. And your possible destinations are along the left, and they include DSP mixer channel inputs. Really should be labeled over on the right for destinations, and hardware outputs. Okay? And what I've done is I've skipped showing the DSP outputs because they are hardwired. So USB out to your digital audio workstation, slots 1 and 2 are masters left, right, 3 through 10 are the auxiliaries, and 11 through 32 are channels 1 through 22. Okay, so this one shows the default mapping of hardware inputs to the DSP input. Okay, so this is the default mapping. Hardware inputs go. But we could instead, if we want to send to the DSP mixer, we could send one of the DSP master outputs. So here we're allowed to route the output of one channel to the input of another channel in our DSP mixer. Here's our DSP mixer. And so the default is that we come in here from hardware inputs. We're mapped to the DSP. We do our mixing and adjust our levels and come out from there to the hardware outputs. Okay? So this shows that added flexibility. We are allowed to directly route the output of one channel into the input of another. Okay, you could do that using this part of the matrix. And all of these are available through the GUI here if you click on various combinations of sources and destinations. Down here we have the opportunity to route our hardware inputs directly to hardware outputs. So we could make it so, for example, that hardware input number 10 is mapped directly out to auxiliary 8, for example. We can do whatever we want here. We don't have to map the hardware inputs into the DSP mixer. We can map them directly to the outputs. tremendous amount of flexibility here. Finally, down here, these are the default mappings of our DSP outputs to our hardware outputs. Okay. This diagram over here just continues with the same set of destinations, showing the possibilities of mapping our USB channels 1 through 32 through the mixer. So at the top here, we have the opportunity to route our USB input slots, we call them slots on the USB instead of channels, to the DSP inputs here. And this is very much like a button on this device, which allows you, this button right here, allows you to take the input from the USB and bypass the hardware inputs, okay? So this allows you to take the input for one of the channels in the mixer coming directly from, say, Logic Pro through the USB inputs. So we're routing USB inputs to the DSP inputs. So we're going to bypass the hardware inputs and send, say, Logic Pro channel strip out into the mixer here. Finally, out here, down here, it gives us the opportunity to route USB inputs into the mixer from, say, Logic Pro directly to the hardware outputs. Okay, tremendous amount of flexibility here in a digital mixer. Shown here at the bottom is this DSP. So by default, we come in hardware inputs, go to the input of the DSP. So here are our mixer channel inputs, 1 through 24, line in left and line in right. Those are exactly what are shown here as our DSP inputs. And again, we come in the top and then go out the right. And so here is the entire matrix of auxiliary sends. So we can map any one of these input channels and send it to any one of these auxiliaries. And every one of these little circles here will have a little volume control or a fader on the auxiliary sends. And these are, I suppose I should do it in green because they are what you see on your analog mixer here, these green knobs. These are the auxiliary sends. We have only 2 auxiliaries on here, which are the AUX 1 and AUX 2 on the analog mixer. But on the digital mixer, we've got 10 auxiliary channels. Okay, so every one of these has a little volume control on it. On top of that, each auxiliary has a master volume control on it. Okay. Finally, we can also send all of these DSP mixer inputs to the master output. Okay, these are our master channel pans and faders. These are shown on the analog mixer as the main faders and pan buttons. Okay, so we have that opportunity here. And so I'm going to show you now in the UI24 how you get to all these different auxiliary sends. These master channel pans and faders are easy. They're always visible. Here is a picture of sort of a schematic of a mixer with lots of input channels along the top and lots of auxiliary sends as we go down. And then down here we have the master sends and the master fader, okay? And so if you want to find, so as I say, there's lots of volume controls on sending all these different channels to all of these different auxiliaries. Moreover, each auxiliary has its own master control. If you want to get to the auxiliary masters in the UI24 interface, you just hit the auxiliary masters button. Boom, here are the auxiliary master faders. Okay, instead of green knobs, they're actually faders. Okay, hit the auxiliary masters, boom, you've got the auxiliary masters. If you want to get to all the auxiliary sends for a given channel, what you're going to do is you're going to hit the edit channel button, And then you're going to hit, you've got on any channel you can set the equalization, the gating, compression, effects sends, and patching. Here's the auxiliary sends for that channel. And here we have for a particular channel. Which channel is this? Okay, this is channel 4, and here are all the auxiliary sends, to auxiliaries 1 through 8 for channel 4. And then you can hit different channels to get their sends. And these are all the auxiliaries for a given channel. So these are vertical slices in this matrix of auxiliary outputs. Finally, if you want to see all of the sends from all the different channels to a single auxiliary output, you hit the auxiliary sends button. And you choose the auxiliary you want, and then you'll have faders for all those channels sending to that auxiliary output. And you can click up here to get different auxiliary outputs. And so this is, I think, a nice way of understanding all of these different controls in the DSP. These are some of the main things in the DSP that you're going to come across. And I think that does it for this video. Hope it's interesting. Thanks for listening.